Hi, hello. I just want to do a video on the subject of value and suffering and why suffering does matter and the context of value. And I want to argue against the argument that suffering doesn't matter. I guess you would call that nihilism or something along the lines of that. I don't know if all nihilists will necessarily agree. I don't want to label anyone. But I want to argue that suffering does matter, and I want to argue against anyone that doesn't think it doesn't matter, because I know where they're coming from, I think, when they make this argument that suffering doesn't matter. Well, I think they are confusing two different ideas that since it happened in the past, and I don't mean to psychoanalyze anyone that may hold this opinion, but whatever happens in the past doesn't matter because it's already over. But they recognize that they felt something when they had that experience or watched someone have that experience. They saw the expression on their face. They know exactly what was happening. It meant something when it was happening, but they want to say it didn't mean anything. I guess it's a coping mechanism. But I think these people need to realize that just because you want to eat your ice cream, you have your bowl of ice cream out, and I tell you the truth and I ask you to accept it, doesn't mean you can't indulge in the ice cream, the fantasy. You can still indulge in the fantasy. You just have to acknowledge the truth and only bring these acknowledgments of truth when you're talking philosophy, the facts of reality and the truth. So you can still indulge in a fantasy. You can still eat your ice cream. You can still eat your meat or whatever it is that you want to indulge in. You can still indulge in fantasy. You can still stare at the ceiling and imagine whatever you will want. Imagine you're living in a fantastical world where nothing really has any consequences. You can look through that context lens. You just can't bring it to an argument. You can accept and accept this reality and acknowledge it, and you can still live your fantasy. You can still acknowledge the truth and live your fantasy. But many people have this strange disconnect that if they accept this fantasy, they almost in a way, I suppose, they get off on the idea of having people think that they actually believe these fantasy things they indulge in. And I don't think that's a good idea. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say I don't think it's a good idea. I just think it's in a way you're fooling yourself. I think that you can come to reality, accept reality, and still indulge. I think these people may be doing that. They just, when an argument, if you come off as aggressive, from what I've seen in many of these videos, is that if you come off too aggressive, they'll just hold their beliefs even stronger than they did before. So I think it's more of an argumentative thing, that they point out one little fantasy that they have, you attack it as if it's silly, then they'll almost indulge in the fantasy even more and say that that's the truth. I don't know. I just think that whatever it is, you can still, and without feeling like you were stupid in the past for believing such things, you don't have to. But like I said, you can still come to the conclusion that you can still indulge in your fantasies and still believe the truth. And that's really not that hard of a thing to do. We're not saying you can't live an enjoyable life and enjoy life as much as you can. You can still enjoy your life as much as you want. And no one's arguing that you can't do that. And back to the suffering thing, I want to point out that suffering does matter just as much now as it did in the past, if we're talking in context of something that happened to you in the past, or any suffering that happened. It does matter. It leads to where you are now. And the suffering, regardless of it happening in the past, and I think the argument is that since time is so fleeting that you don't even recognize the moment you're in until moments later, how everything is so fleeting, time is a constant movement, right? And that since it's happened in the past, it's fleeting, and it can have been over just seconds ago, and it doesn't matter all of a sudden in the context of the argument that they're presenting. And it does matter regardless. I think, and I think they do understand this. Whoever argues for this, that suffering doesn't matter, or nothing matters, it does matter. But I think, in a way, a lot of the same people want to argue that when they're feeling good, ignore the argument and just say it matters, that my existence does have some meaning. but it just doesn't matter in the same way that suffering matters. I'm trying to get on track of the point I'm trying to make. So yes, even if you die, it doesn't change the fact that something did happen when you were alive. Your suffering and when you're alive matters just as much even if you are dead. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, sort of like the tree falling in the forest and there was no one there to listen. The tree still fell in the forest, and the facts still present themselves as such. And even if you come by later, the process still happened. The sound waves still came out of the tree. Things still, the scientific facts, or the hard facts of reality still exist, regardless of someone being there or not. And sort of like when you're dead, sort of like no one being there in the forest to see the tree fall, the suffering still did happen, sort of like the tree falling still did happen. The process still happened, and it still mattered, even if the person is no longer there to give context to the situation. That it did matter when they did suffer. And I would say that, sort of like even if you're alive, it does matter, and I would say just as much, if not more. In the end, it matters all the same. That suffering does matter, and the more you suffer, I would say the more it matters, and the more it is to mitigate, the more important it is to mitigate the suffering and acknowledge that suffering as something that does have a meaning. And many of the people that are arguing that suffering does matter are the same people that find, at least philosophically, in a philosophical discussion that I've seen on here, is that when they say life doesn't matter, it's the redundancy and the accomplishment in life that we're not really accomplishing. We're fighting a negative all the way through. That's all we're doing in life. Doesn't matter how much you fight, there's only reaching a zero. If you want to put it metaphorically, that there's only a zero-sum game that we're playing here. And that's all we're accomplishing. No matter how hard you work for something, it's only going to lead to maybe an even stronger conviction, feeling like you want to accomplish something else, even though you've accomplished something. You're constantly, I would say, yes, addicted. Once you finish something or looking for something else to accomplish, you're eating only to survive long enough to eat again. You're satisfying your libido only long enough to satisfy your libido again. And once you procreate, you're completely disposable. You no longer have any sort of evolutionary purpose anymore, according to the laws of the fact of the creatures that we are on this planet. The context of our existence means you have no meaning in that context anymore. But it does matter. Suffering does matter, and that's what I'm saying is the value. There is value in these suffering moments now, just as much as it happened then. And if there's suffering now, and the cost that you pay for having these good moments matters. Just you have to. It does matter the cost that we pay to have these good moments that we have, and to the cost in these negative moments, and the cost in these negative moments is too much to gain only an avoidance of these negative moments, because there's nothing more here. We're paying a price just to avoid a negative. And I would say that's obviously something you have to consider when you're making these value judgments. I know there's another point I wanted to make in this video relating to it. I mean, yes, they've made it this far. The people that would claim this, they know it because they've made it this far long enough to not have made a mistake, to make value judgments that was conducive to their survival, and they recognize this. They haven't killed anyone. Why haven't they gone out and killed anyone? You're not considering the consequences when they've had a vendetta against someone. They've all considered these things, and I would obviously strengthen that that fact. But many of these people are very, I would say, the people that argue that suffering doesn't matter are people that probably have a very vengeful personality. They almost, in a way, want to defend the idea, but they know it's not true. They're almost fighting for a idea that they want to exist but doesn't exist. I don't know. I just think it's not a good argument to have when you're discussing this kind of stuff. And I do apologize. This is my first video where I'm actually talking about talking about a subject and going on. I don't really know. I'm sort of aimlessly going wherever I'm going. I'm sorry if I didn't make any as much sense as I could have. And I just want to point out that suffering does hold value, regardless. And the fact that when you die, that death gives you no context of suffering. You have no context of anything. You don't feel. You have no consciousness. You're not aware. You're not sentient anymore. It only lends more credence to the argument that suffering does matter, because when you're alive, all you can do is, feeling is something you can only do when you're alive. And when you feel bad, the value is there, that the suffering is something that has meaning. And that is something, and that's one of the most important things in this world that we live in. It's the most important thing. It's the only thing that matters. And I would argue that that is obviously something that we have to consider, because we all affect each other. If you want to use a word or an idea, it's the butterfly effect. We all affect each other, and the prices we pay obviously have a cost. I mean, we have to pay a price, and the cost is often too high for something that we can never accomplish, which is only avoid, and the only thing we can accomplish is avoiding negatives. And the price that we pay by paying with larger negatives just to avoid negatives is a game that doesn't sound like it makes much sense or sounds too worthwhile. It's something that you recognize when you should be able to recognize every time you do the same old thing every day. And it's something I've come to recognize, how every time you eat and every time you do anything, redundant tasks, or you accomplish something, you're only looking to accomplish something else. When you eat, you only eat to get hungry again. You only eat to satisfy your hunger so you get hungry again later on to survive longer. And the same thing with libido. And the same thing with defecating, or everything, every redundant task, every accomplishment you want to do. It's the very fundamental laws by which we play this game. There's no other game. There's nothing else to do here, and it's all a game to get a negative, a lesser negative, and by paying with a larger negative, and that's the only way you get that lesser negative that gives it any context or meaning, is by going through something worse, only to have a context of the feeling that something is better because you went through something worse. So I would say suffering, there is value in suffering, and it does mean something, regardless of what anyone says or not. And I do know they acknowledge this, whoever's arguing against that. So I would say it does matter, and I would say that, yeah, I guess that's the only point. I'm losing track of myself, so I appreciate it. I think there may be some other points I want to make in this argument. It's just I had some ideas and I lost track of them before I started making this video, and I might address them in a later video, and I don't want to redo this video again, so I'm just gonna do it this way. And I'm still getting used to the video making, and I want to make sure it gets better, but it's something I'm still getting used to, and I do appreciate it if you did listen, and I hope you have a nice day and all that and such. So thank you, and I might address more points in a later video. So thank you for watching, and recognize that suffering does matter and it has value. Every feeling that you have when you're alive, and there's nothing more to the game than trying to avoid a greater risk of pain or suffering. And that's all you're doing when you're trying to accomplish anything. You're addicted and you're satisfying a hunger, a deprivation that seems to fill the hole in you, to make you give you an illusion of a negative. So that's all I want to say, and I do appreciate it. And thank you for being patient. And I wanted to make this video as natural as possible, so I'm going to make a lot of errors. So thank you, and have a nice day. Bye. Bye.